Two boys entered the Tower of London. They were never seen again. No bodies were found. No trial was held. No answers were given. And yet, one man walked out wearing a crown. His name was Richard. History often tells us this is where the story ends. It doesn't, because the disappearance of the princes did not close a mystery. It created a king who could never escape it. Richard III did not inherit peace. He did not inherit legitimacy. He inherited suspicion. A silence so heavy, it followed him into every room, every decision, every act of rule. Some say he was a murderer. Others say he was a victim of Tudor propaganda. But this story is not here to comfort either side, because whether Richard ordered the deaths or merely benefited from their absence, the result was the same. A throne built not on victory, not on conquest, but on what was never spoken aloud. This is not the story of two missing princes. This is the story of what their silence demanded in return. This is Richard III, the silence that crowned a king. The princes did not vanish with a scream. They vanished without a sound. No midnight confession. No blood-stained blade. No body carried into the light. Just absence. And absence in late 15th century England was not neutral. It was political. When Edward V entered the Tower of London in the summer of 1483, he did so as king in name. He was 12 years old, newly crowned by proclamation, and entirely unprepared for the machinery that now surrounded him. Beside him was his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury. Together, they represented a future that depended on protection. That protection was entrusted to one man, Richard of Gloucester. On paper, the arrangement was lawful, customary, even reassuring. The late king's brother would govern until the coronation. He would secure the realm. He would guard the heirs. And for a brief moment, England believed him. But power, once granted, has a habit of changing its own terms. Within weeks, the language shifted. Whispers began to replace proclamations. Legal arguments surfaced, not shouted, but carefully assembled. Edward V, it was said, was not legitimate. Nor was his brother. Their father, Edward IV, had allegedly entered a prior marriage. If true, it rendered his children illegitimate in the eyes of the law. The claim did not come from the streets. It came from the pulpit, from Parliament, from men who understood that in England, legality mattered more than innocence. And so, without a sword drawn, the line of succession collapsed. The princes remained in the Tower. Richard of Gloucester did not announce their deaths. He did not need to, because soon, no one saw them at all. At first, this was not alarming. The Tower was a royal residence. Privacy was expected. But days passed, then weeks. Courtiers noticed the absence. Foreign ambassadors reported unease. London murmured. And still, Richard said nothing. Silence, in another man, might have been weakness. In Richard, it became authority. On the 6th of July, 1483, Richard was crowned King of England. There was no public reckoning for the princes. No funeral. No official explanation. Their disappearance was not denied. It was simply left unaddressed. And that was the moment the crown changed hands. Richard III did not seize power in battle. He did not storm Westminster or overthrow an army. He inherited a vacuum. But vacuums do not remain empty for long. Into that space poured suspicion. Every reform he introduced would be read as defense. Every silence would be read as guilt. Every delay would be interpreted as concealment. Richard understood this. He had to. Yet he also understood something more dangerous. To speak was to invite accusation. To deny was to suggest there was something to deny. And so, he ruled. He governed. He legislated. He held court. While the question remained, unspoken but everywhere, what happened to the princes? Richard never answered it. Whether that silence was strategy, fear, or something darker, history would decide without him. Because from that moment on, Richard III was no longer merely a king. He was a man defined by an absence he could never fill. And as we will see, that absence would shape every decision he made until it finally consumed him. Protector, usurper, or something worse. Richard did not take the crown by force. That is what makes this story dangerous. No army marched on London. No rival king was dragged through the streets. No blood stained the steps of Westminster. Instead, power changed hands through language, words, law, procedure. Richard of Gloucester did not call himself a usurper. He called himself a necessity. England, he argued, was on the brink of chaos. A boy king, a divided nobility, a realm still scarred by civil war. Someone had to step in. And that someone, by lineage, experience, and proximity, was him. The case against the princes was not shouted. It was constructed carefully, legally, irreversibly. A sermon was delivered at St. Paul's Cross. Not a battlefield, but a pulpit. From there, the claim was laid bare. Edward IV had been pre-contracted to another woman before marrying Elizabeth Woodville. If true, it meant everything that followed was void. The marriage, the heirs, the crown. Parliament confirmed it soon after. The document was called Titulus Regius, title of the king. It stripped the princes of legitimacy with ink, not iron. Richard did not need to explain where the boys were. According to the law, they no longer mattered. And that was the moment the story turned. Because legality does not erase memory, London remembered seeing Edward V. They remembered his face, his youth, his claim. They remembered that he had entered the Tower as king. And now, he was simply gone. Richard understood the risk. Every day, the princes remained unseen. The question grew heavier. Not louder, heavier. He could have produced them. He could have paraded them. He could have confined them openly, like so many before. But that would have kept them alive in the public mind. Instead, Richard chose absence. Whether by design or consequence, the result was the same. The princes faded from sight, and Richard stepped fully into power. His coronation was swift, efficient, almost restrained. No celebration of triumph, no language of conquest, just order. But order, built on silence, is fragile. Foreign ambassadors noticed the tension immediately. Reports were sent abroad, cautious but clear. Something was wrong. Within England, loyalty began to thin. Men did not rise up for the princes. They whispered about them. And whispers are more corrosive than rebellion. Richard tried to govern beyond the doubt. He traveled the realm. He listened to petitions. He reformed laws that had long favored the powerful. Justice, for once, seemed reachable. But none of it answered the question. What had happened in the Tower? Richard never addressed it. Perhaps he believed time would bury it. Perhaps he believed silence would protect him. Perhaps he believed that to speak would be worse than to say nothing at all. But silence has a cost. Because every rival, every conspiracy, every challenge to his rule now had a name. The princes, even those who did not believe Richard guilty, understood the problem. As long as the question remained unanswered, his crown would never be secure. And in that sense, guilt no longer mattered. Richard III was trapped. If he denied the rumors, he legitimized them. If he explained, he exposed himself. If he ignored them, they grew. This was not the rule of a tyrant drunk on power. It was the rule of a man walking a narrowing path. Protector, king, suspect. And as we will see, the silence that placed the crown upon his head would soon begin to pull it away. A throne built on rumor. Rumor does not arrive like an army. It seeps. It does not announce itself. It waits to be repeated. And by the time it is spoken aloud, it already feels true. By the winter of 1483, England was no longer asking what had happened to the princes. It was assuming it knew. No proclamation had accused Richard of murder. No witness had stepped forward. No evidence had been placed before a court. And yet, the conclusion was spreading. Because absence invites invention. In taverns, the story grew teeth. In noble houses, it gained polish. In foreign courts, it acquired purpose. Ambassadors wrote carefully worded letters home. They did not accuse the king. They did not need to. They described a realm uneasy with itself. A king shadowed by questions. Two princes no one could account for. That was enough. Richard felt the pressure closing in. Not from open revolt, not yet, but from the slow erosion of certainty. Men still bowed. Councils still met. Laws were still enforced. But loyalty was changing its shape. It became cautious, conditional, quiet. Richard responded as a ruler under siege, even if the siege had no walls. He moved constantly, traveling the kingdom, not as a conqueror, but as a presence. Seen rule was safer than unseen rule. He rewarded service quickly. He punished disloyalty faster, not out of cruelty, but out of calculation, because hesitation in a climate of rumor looked like weakness. Yet the more he acted, the more the story hardened. Every arrest became proof. Every execution became confirmation. Every silence became admission. Rumor does not require consistency. It only requires repetition. And repetition was everywhere. One version claimed the princes had been smothered in their sleep. Another insisted they were poisoned. A third suggested they still lived, hidden away, waiting. Contradiction did not weaken the tale. It strengthened it, because the core remained unchanged. Richard was at the center. He could not escape this. To deny the stories would give them a stage. To investigate them would give them legitimacy. To explain would invite scrutiny he could not control. So he chose what had worked before: silence. But this silence was different. It no longer felt deliberate. It felt defensive. And the crown began to show it. Foreign alliances hesitated. Potential marriages stalled. Support thinned at the edges. Not because Richard had been proven guilty, but because doubt had become dangerous. In England's recent memory, doubt had led to civil war, to cousins killing cousins, to kings falling not by law, but by blade. No one wanted to fight for a man surrounded by unanswered questions. And then there was Henry Tudor, still distant, still obscure, but listening, waiting. Rumor cleared the ground before he ever set foot on English soil. Because by now, Richard was no longer being judged as a king. He was being judged as a story. And stories do not need proof. They need shape. They need repetition. They need an ending that feels right. Richard III was losing control of the narrative. And once a king loses that, the crown is already slipping. Because in the end, power is not held by those who rule. It is held by those who are believed, and belief was turning against him. By now, Richard did not need enemies to feel threatened. The watching was enough. Every hall echoed longer than it should have. Every pause in conversation felt deliberate. Every silence carried weight. Richard III ruled a kingdom that no longer looked away. He understood the danger of this better than most. England had lived through decades of suspicion before. Kings had fallen not because they were weak, but because they were doubted. So Richard tightened control. Not with spectacle, not with terror, but with attention. He placed trusted men where loyalty mattered most. He demanded clarity where ambiguity once survived. He moved swiftly, decisively, leaving little space for hesitation. Because hesitation invited interpretation. And interpretation, in a kingdom already infected by rumor, could be fatal. Richard's government became efficient. Records were kept more carefully. Justice moved faster through the courts. To many, this was reform. To others, it felt like surveillance. Men began to notice how closely the crown listened, how quickly dissent was answered, how narrow the margin for error had become. This was not paranoia. It was adaptation. Richard was governing as a man who knew that every mistake would be magnified. And mistakes did come. Executions followed accusations, not indiscriminately but pointedly. Each one carried a message. The crown was alert. The crown was watching. Yet even these acts failed to quiet the unease, because the question beneath everything remained untouched. What happened in the tower? Richard did not speak of it, and in doing so, allowed others to speak for him. Those who feared him called it tyranny. Those who served him called it necessity. Neither side could prove their case. But proof was no longer the standard. Perception was. Foreign courts measured him carefully. Alliances were discussed, then delayed. Marriages were proposed, then quietly withdrawn. A king under watch was a risk. Richard felt the isolation closing in. He was present everywhere, yet trusted nowhere. Even loyalty became conditional. Even silence became suspect. And still, Richard did not retreat. He toured the realm again, held councils, issued proclamations. Visibility became his shield. But visibility cuts both ways. The more he appeared, the more he was judged, not by what he did, but by what he had not explained. This was the paradox of his reign. The harder he worked to rule as a king, the more he was measured as a suspect. No amount of order could erase uncertainty. No reform could outpace doubt. Richard III was no longer merely governing England. He was defending his right to be believed. And belief, once fractured, does not mend quietly. It demands resolution. Sooner or later, the watching turns into waiting, and waiting becomes expectation. Richard's enemies understood this. They did not need to defeat him. They only needed time. Because a king who rules under watch eventually rules alone. And alone, even a crown begins to feel heavy. As we will see, the eyes upon Richard were not just observing. They were measuring, and history was already preparing its verdict. Richard's greatest danger did not stand inside England. It waited beyond it. While the court watched him, while rumors pressed inward, a name began to gain weight far from London: Henry Tudor. At first, he was barely worth mention. Exiled, poorly connected, His claim to the English throne was thin, stretched through a distant maternal line, patched together by convenience rather than strength. By the standards of medieval legitimacy, Henry Tudor should not have mattered. But legitimacy does not thrive in isolation. It thrives in contrast. And Richard III provided that contrast. Henry did not need to prove he was the rightful king. He only needed Richard to look questionable. That was the Tudor problem. Richard understood this too late. As doubts gathered around the crown, Henry's weakness became an advantage. He had no record to defend, no decisions to justify, no silence to explain. He was not burdened by questions about missing princes. He was not shadowed by rumors rooted in absence. He was, by comparison, untouched. And so, foreign courts began to listen. Not because Henry was impressive, but because Richard had become risky. France watched carefully. So did Brittany. Support did not come all at once. It arrived cautiously, disguised as tolerance, then interest, then quiet backing. Henry learned quickly. He spoke little. He promised much. Above all, he let Richard's reputation do the work. Every rumor weakened the crown. Every hesitation abroad narrowed Richard's options. And Richard could do little to stop it. To denounce Henry would elevate him. To ignore him would embolden him. So the king remained focused inward, even as the threat took shape beyond the horizon. This was the fatal imbalance of Richard's reign. He ruled England, but the story of England was now being told elsewhere. Men who might once have remained loyal began to hedge. They did not defect openly. They waited, because waiting had become the safest position of all. Henry Tudor was patient. He did not rush invasion. He allowed the pressure to mature. Because he understood something fundamental. He was not fighting Richard the man. He was fighting Richard, the question. And questions, once embedded, cannot be defeated by force alone. Richard attempted to shore up his position. He sought alliances. He negotiated marriages. He reaffirmed authority. But every effort carried the same shadow. What happened in the Tower? No foreign treaty could erase it. No alliance could ignore it. By now, Richard was not merely under watch. He was under evaluation. And Henry Tudor was the alternative. Not because he was loved, but because he was not doubted. That distinction mattered. As plans began to form across the Channel, Richard sensed the shift. The waiting had ended. The watching had turned outward. Soon, Henry Tudor would stop being a name spoken in exile and become a man in motion. And when that happened, the silence that had crowned Richard would finally demand a reckoning. Because history does not tolerate unresolved power. It replaces it. Bosworth was not meant to be dramatic. It was meant to be decisive. No grand siege, no long campaign. Just one field, one morning, and two claims to a crown that could not coexist. By August of 1485, Richard knew the waiting was over. Henry Tudor had landed, not with overwhelming force, but with enough. Enough men, enough promises, enough belief. Richard moved quickly. This was the kind of challenge he understood. Not rumor, not whisper, but an enemy you could see. For the first time in years, Richard faced a problem that could be solved with steel. The field near Bosworth was chosen not by strategy, but by momentum. Armies collided because there was nowhere else to go. Richard commanded the larger force. He held the crown. He held the high ground. On paper, the advantage was his. But paper had already failed him once. The battle did not begin with chaos. It began with hesitation. Men watched each other carefully. Nobles weighed allegiance one last time. Some waited to see which way history would lean. Richard could feel it. This was not simply a test of arms. It was a test of belief. And belief was no longer firmly on his side. As the fighting thickened, the truth became unavoidable. Richard was being abandoned. Not openly, not dramatically, but subtly. Commands delayed, support withheld, opportunities missed. Loyalty, once conditional, was now transactional. Richard saw Henry Tudor across the field. Close enough. That moment matters, because what Richard did next tells us more than any rumor ever could. He charged, not toward safety, not toward retreat, but directly at Henry. This was not the act of a coward, nor the calculation of a tyrant. It was the choice of a man who understood that only one ending remained open to him. If Richard could not rule as a king, he would die as one. He cut through Henry's guard with brutal efficiency. Men fell around him. The crown itself became a target. For a brief instant, history balanced on a blade. And then it broke. Richard was struck down, not in flight, not hiding, but fighting. His body was found among the fallen, stripped of armor, marked by multiple wounds. The crown did not fall gently. It was claimed. Henry Tudor was proclaimed king on the field. There would be no trial, no inquiry, no careful accounting of what had led them here. Victory does not ask for explanations. Richard's death solved one problem, but it created another, because the questions did not die with him. What happened to the princes? Henry did not answer it either. He did not need to. Richard was gone, and that was enough. Bosworth ended the man, but it did not end the story. In death, Richard became useful. A defeated king. A suspicious king. A king no one needed to defend anymore. What followed would not be history in the strict sense. It would be something more permanent. A version. Because from this point on, Richard III would belong not to evidence, but to those who had won. And as we will see, the man who died at Bosworth was only the beginning. Richard did not die at Bosworth alone. Something else died with him. Control. Because once the crown changed hands, the story changed hands with it. Henry Tudor did not need to explain how he had won. Victory speaks for itself. What he did need was a past that justified his future. And Richard III was perfectly placed to provide it. Dead men do not argue. They do not contradict. They do not defend themselves. They become material. In the months and years that followed Bosworth, Richard's reign was not analyzed. It was reshaped. His silences were no longer cautious. They were sinister. His decisiveness was no longer necessary. It was cruel. Every doubt that had once surrounded him was now treated as confirmation. The princes in the tower were no longer a question. They were an answer. No trial was ever held. No evidence was produced. None was required. Because Tudor England did not need proof. It needed certainty. And certainty, when power demands it, can be written. Chroniclers adjusted their tone. Stories hardened. Details sharpened with every retelling. Richard's physical form began to change as well. He was bent, twisted, marked outwardly, as though his body itself had betrayed his soul. This was not history. It was symbolism. In a world that believed God marked evil on the flesh, a deformed king felt right. And so the image settled. Richard the monster. Richard the child killer. Richard the tyrant. By the time Shakespeare inherited the story, the verdict had already been delivered. The playwright did not invent the villain. He perfected him. On the Tudor stage, Richard was everything the new dynasty was not. He was chaos where they were order, cruelty where they were mercy, usurpation where they were destiny. The hunchbacked king, slithering with ambition, haunted by ghosts. It was theater, yes, but it was also policy. Because for the Tudors, Richard did not simply have to be defeated. He had to be remembered as wrong. Shakespeare's Richard does not rule. He schemes. He does not govern. He murders. He is not trapped by suspicion. He creates it. And that distinction mattered, because it erased ambiguity. It erased doubt. It erased the uncomfortable truth that Richard's rise had been legal, his reforms real, his guilt unproven. The monster solved everything. It justified the coup. It sanctified Bosworth. It closed the book on the princes without ever opening a grave. And for centuries, it worked. Richard III became a character, not a king. A warning, not a question. Schoolchildren learned his crimes as fact. Audiences cheered his downfall. And history, comfortable with the villain, stopped asking why. But monsters are convenient. They prevent deeper investigation. They distract from systems, from structures, from collective responsibility. If Richard alone was evil, then everyone else was innocent. The nobility who abandoned him, the preachers who legitimized his rise, the parliament that crowned him, all absolved. Because the monster carried the blame. Richard III did not write this ending. He was written into it. And once written, the ink did not fade. As we will see, it would take centuries and a body beneath a car park to force history to look again. For more than 500 years, Richard III existed only as a story, a villain on a stage, a name in a chronicle, a crown stained by suspicion. And then, in 2012, someone dug into a car park, not a battlefield, not a cathedral, not a royal tomb, a place built for forgetting. Beneath layers of tarmac and time, they found bones, bent, broken, unmistakably human. The skeleton told a quieter story than the plays ever had. This was no monstrous hunchback, no twisted caricature designed to signal evil. The spine showed scoliosis, real, measurable, survivable. The body bore wounds, consistent with battle, not execution, not ritual murder. A king who had fought and fallen. Richard III had returned to history, not as a character, but as evidence. Yet even now, the questions did not disappear. Finding his body did not tell us what happened in the tower. It did not resurrect the princes. It did not restore certainty. What it did was more unsettling. It forced us to confront how easily stories replace scrutiny. For centuries, Richard had been useful as a monster. He simplified the past. He concentrated blame. He absolved everyone else. The discovery beneath the car park did not clear his name. It complicated it, because once the villain gains a body, the story loses its comfort. Historians re-examined sources. Chroniclers were weighed against politics. Shakespeare was returned to the stage, where theater belongs. What emerged was not innocence. It was ambiguity. Richard III was neither hero nor demon. He was a man shaped by civil war, by fragile legitimacy, by silence he could not control. He benefited from the disappearance of the princes. That much is undeniable. Whether he ordered their deaths or merely inherited their absence, remains unproven. And perhaps that is the point. History does not always give us verdicts. Sometimes it leaves us with responsibility. Responsibility to question sources, to separate propaganda from probability, to recognize how power writes and rewrites memory. Richard III ruled for just over 2 years, but his reputation ruled for 5 centuries, until asphalt was peeled back and bones were forced into the light. Not to vindicate, not to condemn, but to remind us that history is not fixed. It is layered, like the ground beneath that car park. And beneath every accepted story, there may still be something buried, waiting. The princes in the tower remain missing. Richard remains unresolved. And perhaps that is the most honest ending history can offer. Not closure, but doubt. History did not give us an answer. It gave us a habit, the habit of choosing a story that feels complete over a truth that remains unfinished. Richard III was buried once in the ground, and then again in certainty. If you are still here, you already understand what most histories avoid. That doubt is not weakness. It is responsibility. There are more stories like this. Stories that refuse to end cleanly. Stories that ask more of the viewer than agreement. We will continue telling them, not to close the past, but to reopen it